Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in a nation desperate for change. Elected in 1985, he was faced with a crumbling economy and a disillusioned people, caused by decades of political and financial deterioration.
Changes were knocking at our doors and windows. We needed the courage for change, even though we understood that change is risky.
The eighth and final leader of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, Gorbachev put together a series of reforms that were unlike anything seen in Soviet history. The well-known policies of perestroika and glasnost were among them. Mikhail Gorbachev issued the Soviet reform of Glasnost in the late 1980s, which granted greater social freedoms to all those in the USSR. His non-violent approach as leader eased strict social controls and raised the Iron Curtain, which had isolated the Soviet Union since its inception. Within the next 5 years, Glasnost would effectively cause the collapse of the Soviet Union and would further establish a new identity for numerous post-Soviet nations, but ultimately failed to change the course of history for modern-day Russia. The last existing empire, the Soviet Union, was a communist, single-party state that had established itself as a world power from its beginning in 1922. The Republic created its iron reputation under the authoritarian leadership of Joseph Stalin, the second leader.
Stalin did a giant's job in pulling the country into an industrial condition, and with a great deal of force. With a great deal of fear and fear of punishment, he did it.
Apart from the many political murders associated with Stalin's Great Purge, many citizens lost their lives as a result of collectivization, a reform movement to solve growing agricultural problems by combining farms and land ownership. This forced change brought food shortages and starvation to the regime, the opposite of its intended purpose. In rural Stavropol, Russia, Gorbachev's farming family was also affected.
His family experienced the harshest aspects of the Stalinist regime. He does say that, and he says, yes, and my family's not different than millions of other families, and I don't want to have that happen again.
During his 30 years as absolute ruler of the USSR, Stalin cemented the Soviet single-party ideology and the violent Soviet approach to national affairs. At the close of the 1950s, the successors to Stalin became embroiled in an extended period of political tension against the backdrop of the Cold War. The evolving global ideology of the West, led by the United States, was pitted against the guarded communist priorities of the Soviet Union, challenging an already fragile relationship between the two worlds. Throughout this time, the USSR became engulfed in the stagnation period, during which the lives of average Russians were largely unimproved. Though Stalin's successors attempted to rid the Soviet Union of his legacy, the reputation of Russia and the USSR remained unchanged. Elected to power in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was a young, energetic idealist. Unlike most earlier leaders, Gorbachev was open to the public and had a non-violent political stance.
The use of force had discredited itself completely. It was no longer possible to stabilize the world by military methods.
He was one of the few who believed in the system and in its potential to be beneficial for the people.
Glasnost was initially used as a mechanism to maintain the momentum of perestroika, a reform movement with the goal of restructuring political and economic aspects of the Soviet Union.
Without openness, without involving people in the political process, reforms cannot be successful.
With Glasnost, government actions became open to the public. There was a wider dissemination of information, and the public had the freedom to express their opinions.
The ability to speak freely after all these decades of Stalinism meant going back over their own history, studying what had actually happened.
Glasnost signified the rise of a new leadership, and the dawn of a new era for the Soviet Union.
There was a very positive feeling about Gorbachev among the population.
Simultaneously, the USSR was struggling with declining production, shortages, and inflation.
His destiny, his fate, was to have oil at $8 a barrel. He had nothing to work with on the economy. So the result was the economic reforms weren't going anywhere while all this information was flowing.
The state of the Soviet system caused many of the Soviet republics to begin to make legal moves towards declaring sovereignty over their territories.
All the key players within the country realized that there is no way to get a better life via reforming the socialist model.
Through his reforms, Gorbachev had made that step possible by giving the republics the ability to choose their own path, hoping that this freedom would promote nationalist feelings. Still, the republic struck up individual rebellions, all of which accumulated into a region-wide revolution against communist control.
Демократия и гласность, которые развернулись в Советском Союзе, привели в движение мощнейшие силы.
1989 was the year in which Gorbachev lost control of the forces that Glasnost and Perestroika had unleashed.
Those movements began to come into contradiction with his attempts to reform the entire Soviet Union, and that was the contradiction that caused the whole place to fall apart.
In Hungary, the dismantling of a section of the Iron Curtain began a wave of movements towards the west. In East Germany, Gorbachev urged the reluctant leaders of the German Democratic Republic to accept and allow internal change. The Berlin Wall was opened and torn down in November 1989, only 2 months later.
If I hadn't tried to let the people breathe freely, if I hadn't tried to open the door to Glasnost and democracy, to stir the society, to get it thinking and acting, I would probably still be in my Secretary General's armchair today.
As the people's hopes faltered under Gorbachev, they began to look towards an even more progressive leader, Boris Yeltsin. With Yeltsin, they could go faster. With Yeltsin, Russian nationalism grew. By late 1990, only one of the Soviet republics, Georgia, remained. A coup against Gorbachev's leadership by hardline members of the Communist Party failed in 1991.
The August Putsch weakened my position, and on the contrary, it fortified Yeltsin's.
In early December of that year, leaders of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia met behind Gorbachev's back to officially declare the USSR extinct and replace it with the Commonwealth of Independent States.
Due to the situation which has evolved as a result of the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, I hereby discontinue my activities at the post of President of the USSR.
26 years later, Gorbachev's legacy is seen in multiple ways. In Russia, many see Gorbachev as the destroyer of a great power, while the West views him as a hero who parted the Iron Curtain and put an end to the evil empire.
He provides history with an example, and a very rare example, of the peaceful dissolution of an empire. When does that happen, really, in history? That the hand of power simply releases and lets go.
Russia, under its current president, Vladimir Putin, has seen some changes in social freedom. However, it has become clear that the difficulties the Putin government has had controlling certain freedoms is due to the change in norms and expectations for leadership that Gorbachev himself initiated. As the final leader of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev's bold reforms and distinctive leadership transformed world order. His undeniable legacy is defined not only by lifting the veil of the Iron Curtain through policies like Glasnost, but also through the foundations for sovereignty he laid in former Soviet satellite republics. Transitions to democracy are notoriously messy, but as Gorbachev once said, "If not me, who? And if not now, when?"